Thank you, everybody. This is Melinda Niffer from Special Education Advocacy Services of Luzerne. Great to have you all here on a Wednesday night again. We have a wonderful presenter here from the Alliance on Seclusion and Restraint, Guy Stevens. He is the founder and executive director. Guy, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. And we are going to talk a little bit today about PA legislation in and of itself, but more broadly, just about the use, the overuse, because it shouldn't be used ever. So even one, it's overuse of this practice, which, really changes a child's trajectory. It changes their emotional capacity. It changes, so much for them and causes so much trauma. So, great that you're here. And I'm going to hand it over to you for a little bit. We're very fortunate that Guy has some slides and everything that he's going to show us, and he's going to talk to us about that. But Guy, if you want to so Guy at a national level is trying to get legislative change, state level and local level, on this practice. So I'm going to pass this over to you, Guy. I know we're getting some audience members already, and we'll be getting the questions flowing too as soon as you're ready.
All right, sounds great. Well, thank you. I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk to you. I always say that through this work over the last few years, I've had the opportunity to meet some really amazing people doing amazing work. There's part of me that wishes that I wasn't here under these circumstances, talking about restraint and seclusion, but nonetheless, it's so rewarding to know that there's so many people out there that are really trying to make a positive change in our schools and to support our children. So I'm really happy to be here and spreading the word about restraint and seclusion and how we can do better. So if you'd like, I've got a slide deck and I can kick into, if you would be so kind as
Absolutely.
to bring that up for me.
Perfect.
Okay. So I see my slides, so I'm going to hope that you do as well. So of course, I'm going to be talking about restraint and seclusion, and give you a little bit of information first, a little bit about myself. And I won't go into a lot of details. I know you probably had a chance to see my bio, but first and foremost, I'm a dad. That's what brought me into this world. I never had a plan in my life to become a children's civil rights advocate, but life had other things in mind. And I had a son that was inappropriately and illegally restrained and secluded. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment. I'm also the founder and executive director, of course, of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. And I have this core belief that I think many of you would probably share. And that is that, that we can do better for our students, our teachers, and our staff, and even our families. And I believe that when we can do better, we have an obligation to do better. So that's a little bit about me. How I got involved in this work really was because my autistic son was illegally restrained and secluded in a Maryland school. I would never have even imagined that restraint and seclusion were things that happened inside of a school prior to it happening to my own son. So unfortunately, it was an experience that I never had anticipated. And when it happened to my son, it initially, the very first time, it happened in the first grade, and it was over something really simple. My son didn't want to come in from the playground. It happened again in the fifth grade, and he had suffered a bit of a loss, and a teacher that he'd been working with for some time had gotten in a car accident and wasn't able to come back. He was having a difficult time. He eloped. He hid in a bathroom, only to come out and be physically restrained, drugged down a hallway, and thrown into an empty classroom. After that, we homeschooled him for 2 years, and we only returned to the public school because he wanted to go back. And we had taken a lot of precaution, gone through the IEP process, really talked about how to best support him. He should never have been restrained or secluded in the first place. Unfortunately, we got him back into public school, and again, they restrained and secluded him. Over a 15-day period when we returned, he was restrained or secluded probably at least 4 times. We think it was about 7 or 8 times. And that led to a significant amount of trauma. I ended up, he ended up getting to the point after 15 days where he was afraid to go back to school. We were afraid to send him back to school. And we immediately advocated for home and hospital or homebound to get him some services. But ultimately, where this led was I had a conversation with him about what had happened and said, look, this should not have happened to you. This is not okay. This is not an okay thing to do to people. And despite the fact that in Maryland, we have fairly strong laws, he was still restrained and secluded for things that wouldn't have met our legal criteria. Our legal criteria says that you shouldn't use restraint or seclusion unless It's an imminent serious physical harm. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But anyway, all of this work for me started with a promise. And the promise to my son was, I will do all that I can to make sure this doesn't happen to you again or others like you. And 3 years later, now we have an organization, and the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was really formed with the idea initially that I wanted to share information. So what we're doing here tonight, this is part of why I wanted to do this. I wanted to be able to share information with others, with other families, with other educators, with anyone who is interested in this. Because I think it's something that is really concerning. And again, we can do better things. So we started about 3 years ago. We've got probably over 17,000 people now following us on social media and connected to our organization. And broadly speaking, it's parents of kids that have been restrained and secluded. It's self-advocates, autistic self-advocates, but it's also educators, teachers, administrators, attorneys, other folks that really realize that, again, we can do better for everyone. So with that, I'm going to go through a few things pretty quickly here tonight because I wanted to give a little bit of an overview of what we were talking about, and then really wanted to dive into a conversation with you and talk about some questions that you have and some of the work that you might be doing in Pennsylvania, and give people ideas for doing things elsewhere. And again, I don't want to make assumptions here about what people may or may not know. So I want to give a little background on what we're talking about when we talk about physical restraint and seclusion. And a physical restraint is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically grabbing, holding someone in such a way that they're not able to move freely. So we say it's a personal restriction that immobilizes a student. They're not able to move their arms and legs and head freely. You may picture a physical restraint. Your mental image, like mine, might be more of a law enforcement setting where somebody is being pinned to the ground. That's a physical restraint. Now, we often say that it doesn't include a physical escort. However, very often kids are restrained and it's called an escort. An escort is actually intended to be something kind of gentle and momentary. It's a light hand on the shoulder or on the wrist. It's not pulling or holding or dragging, but sometimes we see schools that report this as an escort when in fact it's a restraint. These definitions I'm providing you are from the U.S. Department of Education's Restraint and Seclusion resource document. Something came out in 2012. And the reason I'm using these definitions, there are definitions specific to each state, but the fact is every state kind of has their own set of definitions and criteria. So I want it to be fairly broad here. And these federal definitions, I think, are fairly good in terms of defining the terms. Now, physical restraint can look a lot of different ways. There are standing restraints where a single adult might come behind a student and hold the student. There are seated restraints that might involve two or more adults, again, coming alongside a student, using their bodies, getting down to a seated position, not allowing the child to move or go about freely. But there are also things like supine restraint. Now, if you read the definition of supine restraint, you see that the definition says it begins with a takedown. That is exactly what it sounds like. That is actually taking a child down to the ground. That is not a, easy thing to see. It's very traumatic for children. But children are taken down to the ground and they're typically held down in a face-up position in a supine restraint. There's also a restraint called a prone restraint. And prone restraint is much like supine, but it ends up being face down. You've probably heard of prone restraint, even if you're not familiar with the restraint, because you've heard, no doubt, of people that have died being put in prone restraint. This has happened in law enforcement settings. It's happened in schools. It's happened in the troubled teen industry. It's happened in a lot of different places. The use of prone restraint really can be deadly. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about physical restraint. Now, there's also the term mechanical restraint. Mechanical restraint is using some kind of device to restrain a child. Often this is something that is done inappropriately. I would say it's always done inappropriately, but let me be a little clearer with where I was heading. We find, for instance, that there are certain devices out there that have certain intent or intended usage. For instance, a Rifton chair. A Rifton chair is designed to provide positional support where it is prescribed. It is not designed as a place to strap a student to because you're not happy that they're not paying attention. That is a mechanical restraint. And of course, I have the photo here with the roll of duct tape. And that's not just to be to make a point, there have been plenty of stories about kids being duct taped to chairs. In Hawaii a few years ago, there were instances where kids were being actually duct taped to trees. So a mechanical restraint involves some kind of device. It could even be rope. And these things happen. This is not, not making this up here, unfortunately. And then there's seclusion. And I get very specific here with the definition of seclusion because it's important to be specific. The seclusion is an involuntary confinement of a student alone or in a room or area from which they're physically prevented from leaving. So it could be a seclusion room like the one you see photographed here. It could be that you've just backed them into the corner and you're using your body and you're not allowing them to leave. It could be a lot of different things, but again, it's involuntary. Many schools have what they might call a calm room or a cool room. And sometimes as we talk about this, there are multiple things that they will say are happening. They will say, well, kids go there on their own when they want to take a break. Well, if it's truly self-directed, if a kid is truly going somewhere to take a break and they can leave whenever they want, that's not seclusion. But if they are prevented from leaving, absolutely, that would be seclusion. So again, seclusion is not a sensory room. A sensory room can be a positive thing if it's set up in the right way to help kids that need a break or need some kind of sensory stimulus. Members where they've been separated, but they're not there in a punitive way. They should be there working with staff or getting some assistance. So that's what seclusion is and is not. But I want to be careful here because we often hear all sorts of fun names for seclusion rooms. And the name does not change the purpose. So you can call it a reset room, a cool room, a blue room, and a break room, a quiet room. But if you're putting a child in there against their will and not allowing them to leave, and not allowing them to leave might mean you're shutting the door and holding it shut. It might mean you've shut the door most of the way and you've got it shut on your foot, but you're not letting them leave. It could mean the door is open, but you're standing in the doorway and preventing them from leaving. Seclusion is, again, that involuntary isolation. So regardless of what you call the room, regardless of whether or not it's a padded room or a wood made of plywood, or if you look at the lower left photograph, you can see they use file cabinets to create a seclusion space. All of that qualifies as what we would term as seclusion. I also want to mention the term imminent serious physical harm. And the reason I mention that is that if you look at federal guidance says you should never use restraint or seclusion unless, and the unless is, it is a emergency crisis situation and everything else has been tried and the child is presenting an imminent risk of serious physical harm. Now, serious physical harm has a definition. It has a legal definition. It is the same as serious bodily injury. It means a substantial risk of death, extreme physical pain, protracted and obvious disfigurement, or a protracted loss or impairment of a bodily function or organ. This is a high bar. It was intentionally a high bar. It does not mean a kick, a scratch, a bite, a bruise. It means a life-threatening situation. However, despite that guidance, and despite many states that have laws that use that term, what we often find is the majority of restraint and seclusion don't happen for life and death situations. In fact, if you have a school district and you have hundreds of life or death situations in a school year, I would say that you have a very unsafe school. The truth is these things should be remarkably rare. However, what we find in practice is that kids are routinely restrained and secluded for noncompliance, disrespect, minor behaviors, bad language, property damage, sometimes convenience of the staff. Sometimes the staff don't know what else to do. There are a lot of other reasons. And I would say that it's probably 90 to 95% of the cases that I hear that do not meet that imminent serious physical harm standard. So again, give you a couple real life examples. My son was once restrained and secluded for splashing water. Certainly not an imminent serious physical harm. Young man named Cornelius Frederick, shown in the screen capture from the video there, was restrained for throwing a sandwich in a cafeteria. That restraint sadly led to his death. He died due to the use of restraint. But kids have taken off their shoes. They've eloped. They've had anxiety. They've cried, thrown tantrums. All of these things have led to a young man that was singing in class, led to physical restraint and or seclusion. So, now that we have a sense of what these terms mean, I want to talk a little bit about the impact. And I'm going to start on impact by talking about who is impacted most frequently. And most frequently, what we see is that the kids are most often restrained and secluded are children with disabilities, Black and brown children, and boys. And if you dig a little deeper, we're talking about very young children. So when people first hear about restraint and seclusion, what they imagine is it's a 15-year-old that got in a fight. No, that's not what we're generally talking about here. In fact, most states have laws that are separate for situations like that. What we're talking about is often a 5, 6, 7-year-old student. We're not talking about a middle school student. We're not talking about a high school student. We're talking about elementary school students. We're also seeing much more restraint and seclusion in more restrictive settings. So if you're in a general education setting, you're less likely to be restrained and secluded. If you move into a segregated classroom, you're more likely to be restrained and secluded. If you move into a separate special education school, you're more likely to be restrained and secluded. If you move into a private or non-public special education school, you're more likely to be restrained and secluded. Of course, there are exceptions. You move in a residential facility, more likely to be restrained and secluded. So kids, as they move into more restrictive settings, more often are restrained and secluded. Children with a trauma history. This is huge, not only because do we see a lot of children that have a trauma background being restrained and secluded. The fact is the very action of restraint and seclusion are extremely traumatizing. So we're taking a child with complex trauma, we're adding more trauma on top of that, and it increases the likelihood of behavior. So the thing that sometimes people are trying to stop is the thing that they're actually causing to happen more. If we look at disability, and then quick graphic here, in red, children with disabilities, not in red are children without disabilities. 80% of restraints, children with disabilities, 77% of seclusions. Now that comes from a federal data set. I can tell you looking at state data that in my experience, it usually runs higher. It might be 90 to 95% of restraints and seclusions are children with disabilities. There was a case recently in Frederick County, Maryland. It was almost 100%. And Frederick County, Maryland just got investigated by the Department of Justice for that. I think we need more of those kinds of investigations.
Yeah, and Guy, I'd love to talk about that too, because I mean, there were thousands that they hadn't reported, and we're not just talking a couple of parents whose complaint about it, right? They reported zero, and then there were thousands that came out of it.
Well, actually, in Frederick, and there's a couple different cases here. In Frederick, they hadn't necessarily reported zero. They had actually been reporting data at the state level since about 2018. And their numbers, here's what's interesting. I live in Maryland, and the county that I live in, Calvert County, it's a fairly rural county. One of the, somewhere in the middle of the pack in terms of size. We were about 16th out of 23 school districts. My county, though, if you go back 3.5 years ago when this happened to my son, my county was number 1 in the use of seclusion, number 2 in the use of restraint across the state. When you looked at the number of instances against enrollment, you want to know who was number 2 and number 1 in the opposite? It was Frederick County, Maryland. So Frederick County, Maryland, back in 2018, was reporting data to the State Department of Education. And that data reflects.
Yeah, and I do want to correct myself. I was thinking of Fairfax.
Yes.
For that, you know exactly who I was thinking of, right?
Yep. But it's really interesting, isn't it? And Frederick, of course, it was 100% of the restraint and seclusion were kids with disabilities. And of course, Fairfax County is a whole nother story, and we can come back to this. But it's that schools have a couple of different routes they can take. A district can say, gee, we have a problem, we should fix that. That's what happened in my district. Now, I don't want to make it sound easy, because my district wasn't very happy when I raised the issue of restraint and seclusion, when it got in the newspapers, when I had organizations reaching out to them. But ultimately, they formed a committee and we worked collaboratively. And within about 9 months, we had changed the policy and the practice in the county. And now, 3 years later, our usage of restraint and seclusion has dropped significantly. I met with personnel from the school recently. In the first half of this year, there was only 1 seclusion and there were under 10 restraints. Now, that goes against almost 750 seclusions and 700 restraints in years prior. So when they were tied there with Frederick County, they had a lot of restraint and seclusion, and now that they've taken it on, they've reduced that. But we'll get back and we'll talk a little bit more about
we
Fairfax.
Definitely will. Yeah.
Just want to continue on kind of talking about, again, who's impacted. Again, we see, if we look at enrollment versus restraint and seclusion, we see that Black and brown students tend to be restrained and secluded more frequently. And then the question is, what's the impact? What does this lead to? So we know who's impacted, what's the impact on them. And sadly, it's significant trauma, it's injuries, and it can even be death. Trauma is a really important one, and this is something that I spend usually a lot of time talking about. We're to keep it brief today, but as you mentioned earlier, trauma has an impact on our brains. And anyone that might be watching tonight that has had a traumatic experience can probably relate. But when we experience trauma, it can cause actual changes to occur in our brain, areas like the amygdala, which is kind of our smoke detector for our brain, or our alert system. It can even affect prefrontal cortex, which is our executive function. So there's a lot of data out there on this. And a lot of that began around the time they did the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And that showed that there was a correlation between adverse childhood experiences and outcomes, even in adults' lives, in terms of health risk, risks for addiction, a lot of other things. So we know that there's a tremendous impact to the brain when people are traumatized. This is something I created some time ago to try to explain this cycle in a very clear way. And that is, if we think about who's affected by restraint seclusion, and I'm going to begin with talking about disability. um, you know, I mentioned before that there's a lot to do with trauma. There's a lot of the kids that are being restrained and secluded have a trauma history. And what I'd say is there's a really big intersection there between disability and trauma. If you're an individual with a disability, there are certain traumas that you have probably endured in your life. We can even just think of an example of perhaps a non-speaking child, non-speaking autistic child, who's not able to clearly always communicate their needs and wants. Imagine how frustrating that world can be. Imagine not being able to communicate your needs and wants. So we often find that kids with disabilities have also experienced trauma. And that trauma is really important. If we look at this diagram here, trauma is where I begin here. And, if you have a child that has trauma, we know that there's changes that can occur to the brain. Those changes we talked about, what they can lead to is an individual that feels hypervigilant. And by hypervigilant, what I mean is that you may not feel safe. You may be scanning your environment for danger. Somebody that's been through a traumatic event, they might be kind of waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And anybody that's experienced this can probably relate. If you're a child and you've been through trauma, the same thing is happening. You're becoming hypervigilant. And what happens to a child that becomes hypervigilant is we might see what I would term as distress behavior. So we see behavior, we know behavior is communication, but sometimes we react to behavior rather than understanding what the behavior is being driven by. And when a child's having a difficult time, behaviors occur. Very often the response is to demand compliance. It's all about, okay, well, you need to do this, you need to do that. And the child is escalating. And as a child begins to escalate and more demands are placed on the child, they very often will get to a point where they're unable to continue really taking those demands. They may go into a fight or flight mode, or freeze mode. And what happens at that point, that's where we might see something like restraint or seclusion happen. A kid tries to run off. The response is to grab them, to restrain them. And of course, whether it be restraint or seclusion or suspension, expulsion, a lot of other punitive approaches, what can happen there is some form of punishment. And that punishment then is traumatizing. The child begins to doubt their own self-worth. They begin to experience more trauma, and that creates this cycle. So kids that are restrained and secluded, they often have this happen to them over and over again. It's not an effective intervention. It's an intervention that, in fact, leads to more restraint and seclusion. And of course, the trauma is not just the kids experiencing the restraint and seclusion. It can be the other children that are watching. Watching this kind of thing happen can be very traumatic. And beyond that, think about the message. What message are we sending to children when they see the young disabled Black child being physically restrained? There's a lot of issues here. And of course, it is traumatic for teachers and staff as well. And as teachers and staff go through that same trauma cycle, the more they restrain or seclude a child, the more they're likely to feel unsafe. The more likely they are to feel unsafe, the more likely they are to go to a physical intervention. So you see the cycle can build itself in a couple different directions. And of course, we see all sorts of injuries to kids. We see, head traumas, broken bones, scratches, bruises, all sorts of things. I remember the story of an amputation because there was a restraint done and there was pressure put on a limb in such a way it led to an amputation. So there's a lot of injuries that can happen. They can also happen to our teachers and staff. One thing I will say is that very often the injuries that occur happen after someone has initiated a physical restraint or is trying to seclude a child. Once you go hands-on, you are likely to put a child in a fight or flight response, perhaps enter that same fight or flight response yourself. And at that point, the odds of someone getting injured go up astronomically. So, again, we recognize, and one thing here at the Alliance is we're not at all anti-educator. In fact, the opposite's true. We want safer classrooms for the students, the teachers, and the staff. We believe that you can reduce and eliminate these practices and really create more safety in your classroom. So, again, we often find, teachers getting injured using these interventions. And of course, there have been too many tragic deaths. Cornelius Frederick, I mentioned earlier, threw a sandwich in a cafeteria, ended up losing his life after being physically restrained. A young autistic child in California, Max Benson, held face down at a school called the Guiding Hand School, lost his life being restrained. Angelina Arg, 7 years old in 2006, suffocated in a face down restraint. Many, many more. In fact, the Government Accountability Office back in 2009 issued a report about selected cases of death and abuse due to restraint and seclusion. This is not something new. And the fact that it's still going on is really troubling. And then, of course, another byproduct here is that all these punitive practices, restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, the net effect of this is that they're kind of leading many children down what we call the school to prison pipeline. So all of these punitive interactions are leading to kids that don't want to go to school, kids that drop out of school. Our prisons are filled with disabled children, Black and brown children, children that have not gotten the help they need, and as a result have had really terrible outcomes. So I want to talk about why this happens. I don't think that anybody goes into education because they want to restrain or seclude a child. I don't think that, while there can always be bad players out there, I think for the most part, it's really due to two things. And I would say that's culture and training. The culture piece, imagine you're a first year teacher, you get a job in a new school, you go to the new school, and within a few days, you've never even heard of restraint and seclusion, perhaps it wasn't even covered in your undergrad, but you're working with a student that is in your general education classroom that perhaps has disabilities. Maybe they've not yet been identified, that's having behavior. And what you're told by staff is this is what we do when that child's having that behavior. You're not even necessarily briefed on what the law says. You just are briefed on this is how we interact. And that can become what is done. There are teachers that go in and they say, well, this doesn't feel right to me. I don't like this. And they might raise concerns. Sometimes they're led to believe that these things are necessary. They fear for their job. They fear for retaliation. And they may do it. But I also know teachers who have quit their jobs because they haven't agreed with things being done. And it comes down to some of the training that's being offered as well. So some of the training, and I've gone through some of the crisis management training, really doesn't do enough to avoid crisis in the first place. A lot of the training out there is very reactive. It's about, what do we do to de-escalate? Well, the question is, how do we avoid getting to de-escalation in the first place? So what can we do upstream? So training and culture is one of the big, contributors to this. I want to quickly address a couple of myths and misconceptions. First is the idea that restraint is safe, and we hear different variations like, well, it's safe if it's performed by trained staff, or I've even heard it's safe and therapeutic. There was a school in Illinois, and they were opposed to a ban on prone restraint, a dangerous and deadly form of restraint. Last year at the General Assembly, as they were trying to pass a law, this school was fighting back. They wrote a letter to the editor of the Chicago Tribune, and they said, well, prone restraint is safe and therapeutic. Utterly ridiculous. I submitted my own letter as well, and they published both, but it is not at all safe and therapeutic. The idea that it's safe if you're trained, there is one type of restraint that is safe, and that is one in which everyone is volunteering, willing, and able. Meaning that if we have 4 volunteers and they're all willing to show us what a restraint looks like, that can be done safely. But anytime you restrain anyone else that is not willing, there are risks, and the risks are very simple. When you put hands on someone, their bodies will react. It's not even their brain reacting in the kind of cognitive sense. It's their body reacting. And when their bodies react, they may go into a fight or flight response. They may kick, try to run away, flail arms. Restraint is always involving risk. We also hear things like, well, seclusion helps kids to calm down. They need a quiet place to self-regulate. They need a place to calm down. There is nothing calming about being put in a room against your will and having the door held shut. That is not a calming practice. What we sometimes see, and people mistake for calm, is that the child goes in there, they beat on the door, they beat on the walls, they bang their head. After 15 minutes, they seem to calm, kind of melt into the corner of the room. They seem to, from an outside perspective, seem calm. It's not calm. It's potentially a dissociative state. It's our brain going into a defense mode. There is nothing I can do right now to change the outcome that I'm in, and our brain is trying to shut down. This is not a calming state. Imagine for a second that you saw this kind of thing happen out in public. You were at a local Target, and while you were in there, you saw a parent and a child escalating. It continued to escalate. The parent eventually kind of picked up and drugged the child to a changing room, threw the child in the room, held the door shut. As the child beat on the walls of the room, screaming to get out, you would probably call the police. This is not a calming event here when we're talking about seclusion. So we also have parents that believe they're going to know if it's happening. And unfortunately, that's not always true. While some states do have reporting requirements, as you mentioned earlier, Melinda, there's a real problem with states underreporting their data. The Government Accountability Office in 2019 actually provided guidance to the Department of Education saying, you've got real problems here with your data. You need to do something about it. One of the schools that was involved in that was reporting zero was one of the larger school systems in the country, Fairfax County, Virginia. They ended up getting sued over their use of restraint and seclusion by several parents, several organizations. That lawsuit recently settled, and Fairfax is making big changes to what they're doing based on what had happened. But there's a couple reasons that you might not know what's happening. If you have a non-speaking child, they might not be able to come home and tell you about their day. I can't tell you how many non-speaking autistic children's families that I know where their kids have come home with bruises or scratches or other things that have been unexplained, and no one seems to be able to explain what happened. If your child is able to speak and explain what happened to you, don't assume that they will. It's shameful to the child. The child feels shame for getting restrained or thrown into the naughty room. They might not want to share with you. And still there's other kids that sometimes assume that as parents we're magical and we know everything that happens during their day. So they might even assume or somehow are even complicit with what's happening, which can cause problems between relationships of parents and their children. Another myth is kind of this is our only option. We can't, what else do you want us to do? I heard that initially when I began to advocate for change in my own school district was, well, what would you do? What do you expect us to do? And the first time I heard that, I didn't have a good answer. I've got a lot of good answers now, but I took it as a challenge, 3+ years ago, to figure out what are the better things we can be doing. And there's a lot that we can be doing that's better. These things that we're doing now are not helping children. In fact, are causing a lot more issues. Briefly to mention, we have no federal law around the use of restraint and seclusion, which means that all states essentially have their own laws regarding restraint and seclusion. To me, and I didn't mean to mention North Carolina here, that was from an earlier, but to me, this is a civil rights and a human rights issue. Civil rights should not vary at the state line. So as we move from one state to the other, our rights should be the same when it comes to our civil rights. So there is no federal law. The state laws vary quite a bit, even though there was a lot of research back in 2009 to say, hey, kids are dying, kids are abused due to the use of restraint and seclusion. The federal government has not moved. Now, there is some hope there, and I'll talk about it in a second. Now, the federal government has provided guidance. So back in 2012, they produced a document called the Restraint and Seclusion Resource Document. That listed guidance for what they thought states should consider when they made their own laws. So basically, Department of Ed saying, well, there's not a law that's been passed. Here's what we think you should do. And of course, guidance is just that. States can listen to it. They can ignore it. But at the end of the day, some states followed it. Some states didn't. But again, even the states that followed it aren't necessarily following the law with fidelity. So this was one of the first places we saw that idea that imminent serious physical harm, that you never want to use these things unless it's a crisis, unless you've tried everything else. And why do you think the bar is so high? It's so high because the potential is so high of damage, the potential of injury to the student, the potential of trauma. That was recognized in 2016 in what's called a Dear Colleague letter that the Office of Civil Rights provided, really providing guidance to school districts about restraint and seclusion. And in that document, there were a couple things that I found really interesting. One is they said, if you only ever restrained or secluded a child just once, it could actually lead to new challenges and difficulties for that child that, if not appropriately met, could lead to a denial of a free and appropriate public education. FAPE. FAPE is a really important thing when it comes to federal law around children with disabilities. And this guidance recognized the potential of denial of FAPE just from a single instance of restraint and seclusion. They also address this idea that if you're doing this kind of thing repeatedly, they would not typically find that you're doing something that's reasonable. If you're doing this over and over again, that's not crisis management. That's poor planning. I'm saying it a little more bluntly than they said it, but they absolutely said, we would not find in your favor if you were doing this. Now, there is some hope here. And, there is current legislation, which is called the Keeping All Students Safe Act, that was reintroduced last year that is still moving forward. And that legislation would ban the use of seclusion. It would ban the use of prone and supine restraint. It would also provide training and budget to allow for training to help people move away from these interventions. Now, I support CASA. We also do a lot of work around supporting state law. In fact, later I'll share with you, but we just recently created a toolkit for people that are interested in pushing state laws in whatever state they might be in, that talk about, the process, and that provides recommendations for what you might want to include in your state law. But I will mention to you that laws are helpful. Laws can get schools moving in the right directions. However, laws aren't the final answer. We need to change hearts and minds. We need to change culture. We need to change practice. So there's a lot more that comes beyond this that we need to think about as well. And to that, what I would say to you before I wrap this up is that there are better ways. Here at the Alliance, we often talk about one of the first shifts we need to make is really understanding behavior. And there is a tendency in many of our schools to use what I would say is very outdated science. So a lot of our schools are basing their behavioral approaches around 1930s and 1950s behaviorism, around operant conditioning, around rewards and consequences. And what we find is that model works the least for the kids that need help the most. So, while a sticker chart or reward might work really well for my neurotypical daughter, it was the result of some very bad days for my son, where he was working towards a reward that he lost and then didn't understand why, because he'd been working so hard, and led to a lot of problems. I'm a big fan of a guy named Alfie Cohen, who wrote a great book called Punished by Rewards. And Alfie talks about how rewards and punishments are really the same thing. They're saying to a child, if you do this, you will get this, or this will happen to you. And as Alfie would put it, rewards are good at one thing and one thing only, and that's short-term compliance. If kids are not able to meet the demands that you have placed on them, and they are having a difficult time, or their behavior is escalating, what that should signal is that they either don't have the skills to do better, or there's something getting in their way. Very often, one of the other approaches that I like is the approach of collaborative proactive solutions, or collaborative problem solving, which has to do with how do we understand what's getting in a kid's way, and how do we make different assumptions. Dr. Ross Green from Collaborative Proactive Solutions would say kids do well if they can. And while that may not seem like anything earth-shaking at first, if you look at it against what happens in our school, where they believe that kids do well if they want to, it's quite a big difference. If you believe that kids do well if they want to, then what do? You think it's a motivational issue. So you offer rewards and consequences. If you think that kids do well if they can, then you look at it differently. You think, well, gee, do they have a lagging skill or an unsolved problem? If a child had a lagging skill in English, what would we do? We would teach them that skill. But we sometimes assume that, that it's a matter of will, and it's not a matter of skill. Somebody brought up a great example to me the other day, and it just has stuck in my mind. And they said, if I were to come up to you, Melinda, and I were to say, Melinda, what's the capital of Zimbabwe? And you said to me, well, I don't know. And I said, well, Melinda, I'm going to give you $100. What's the capital of Zimbabwe? He said, I still don't know. I could offer you $1,000. All the rewards in the world don't change the fact that you don't know that, or you don't have that skill. So we put a lot of emphasis on, and again, this is a whole nother conversation, but looking at behavior differently, looking at what's below the iceberg. I'm a huge fan of the work of Dr. Mona Delahooke, who has a great book called Beyond Behaviors, that talks about the fact that not all behaviors are even volitional. People think that all behavior is a choice. Not every, you've got to make good choices. Not all behavior is a choice. If you don't feel safe, we have what we call bottom-up behaviors. If you don't feel safe, we may see behaviors that emerge because you don't feel that sense of safety. We may see behaviors that emerge because of past trauma or disability. So at any rate, one of the things we need to do to really progress is change the way people are looking at behavior. And there's a lot of great resources to do that. We often talk about kind of holistically some of the things that we'd like to see people moving towards. And those include trauma-informed approaches, neuroscience-based approaches. If you begin to understand a little bit about the brain, you can instantly really work more effectively with children. I'm a big believer in relationship-driven approaches as well. When talking about my 3 R's of education, I often say they're relationship, relationship, relationship. I know I'm probably not the first to say that, but it's that important. And anyone that's ever had a child that has struggled or had a difficult time, or maybe even been restrained and secluded, isn't it amazing what happens when they're in a new classroom with a different relationship? It can make all the difference in the world. And of course, also a big believer in collaborative approaches and working with kids instead of doing things to kids. So I try to get about an hour and a half worth of information in 30 minutes. And I went over my 30 minutes, so I apologize. But there's a lot to talk about here. So I'm going to wrap it up with that slide. And of course, my contact information's there. But I'd love to talk to you about this more, Melinda, and if we have any questions.
No, that is fantastic. And I'd rather go over to get the information out there than to feel like there was, too much missing out of this, because it's all about getting information and understanding it to be able to make change. Because if we don't, we have several documentaries now about restraint and seclusion, and the first hand information coming from kids and young adults who have been restrained with and without injury, but every single one of them talks about their trauma. So we have, the kids we lose, and I'm actually going to put this link also in the chat because it will take you straight to the video. But Dan Habib has also got a video as well. It's a short film, he calls it, stophurtingkids.com in the film, and I'll put both of those in the chat when we're done. I do want to just briefly, Guy, if you don't mind, I really want to talk about and give the audience the information on restraint and seclusion in PA. So under our Chapter 14, we do have legislation on how restraint can be done, when it can be done, and the parameters around it. I wish we didn't have it. What we don't have in PA is legislation on the recording of seclusion, because it's an aversive technique. Mm-hmm. So under our positive behavior support, under our code 14.133, it specifically says the following aversive techniques of handling behavior are considered inappropriate and may not be used by any agencies in educational programs. That means we don't even have federal reporting of this. And I think that this is really important for parents to know. Your blue rooms, if they're not set up as an actual sensory safe room where the kids are going in, there are sensory items available to them, and they're going in voluntarily, and they can come out voluntarily. It's a seclusion room. Mm-hmm. And it goes to further say locked rooms, locked boxes, or other structures. Now, it doesn't say, or spaces, it doesn't say locked on those. Any other structures or spaces from which the student cannot readily exit. So it doesn't matter whether it has a door or not on it. If the student is being barred by a gym mat, if the teacher is standing in front of the exit and preventing them from going. I have seen, they thought they were so proud of themselves that we don't do restraint in our classroom. We have the gym mats in the corner. So we get the child into the corner and we put all the gym mats up so the child's in. I said, that's seclusion. Right. Oh, no, that's not seclusion. It's our safest way. I'm like, but it's not. You're preventing egress. What are you doing before we get to that heightened state? This is what scares me. And with PA, I have parents that call me all the time and talk about injuries that they've had in the closet. Mm-hmm. I'm like, why are they even in the closet? You need to make a state complaint. But they're so fearful because nobody's stepping in. And that's where, with the Alliance, with your toolkit on how to get legislative change, that might happen. Hazleton Area School District, and I'm just going to name them because there are other public schools that have special education centers. they are designing in the basement of their high school a special education center for 68 kids, 8 classrooms of 8, if my math is correct. So we know that in PA, the 8 students would be autistic class students, and every single one of them has a cool down room with a door. When I went to the board and said, why did we have a door? This is seclusion. We're not allowed to do it. Oh, no, but we're not going to use the doors. We'll take them off.
Right.
Well, then why are you charging the taxpayer over $8,000 for these doors?
What are you going to do with those rooms? Because, again, it doesn't matter if there's a door. There's so many misperceptions about this, in terms of, oh, well, it's not seclusion if, and, very often we find that school staff aren't really appropriately trained in even what their law says. And, they'll get this very narrow idea that, well, seclusion means that we put them in a room and we lock the door. Well, no, it doesn't. And in fact, many states even prevent you from having locking mechanisms on the door. So you actually have to hold the door shut, but that's still seclusion. If your foot's in the door, it's still seclusion. If the door is not shut, but you're using your body, it's still seclusion. If you're placing an object in front of the door, it's still seclusion. If you stand a foot back, but you tell them that they can't leave and they feel that they can't leave, I would consider that seclusion as well. So it's really interesting that they're constructing those rooms, and no doubt they're constructing those rooms to adjoin classrooms that are special education classrooms, which to me shows an intent to discriminate. If you're building a seclusion room and you're building it around certain classrooms, that's discriminatory. So there's a lot of problems there. And I hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say further to that, when I FOIA requested right to note here in PA, how many general education classrooms have self-contained cool down rooms? Guess what? We have none. Not one. Not one. So then I FOIA'd how many cool down rooms are accessible within the public spaces of so not a classroom, but the public hallways. Not one for general ed. Not one. So we're automatically saying these children, it's almost like a target on your back. You know that your child is more likely to get secluded, right? Being in those rooms.
Right. So if this is a crisis intervention, you're planning crisis. If you're planning crisis, you're planning it. I mean, So I mean, there's a lot of issues here. I mean, again, the biggest of which is, the way that I look at this is that I don't think seclusion is ever appropriate for a child. Putting a child in a room against their will and not letting them leave is terrifying. I would say to you that restraint should be exceedingly rare. If you look at restraint in the context of imminent serious physical harm, what I would say is that if a child were going to jump in front of a moving bus, yes, I would want you to do whatever you need to do to save that child's life. Yes, if a child had a weapon with the intent to use it, I would want you to do whatever you need to save the life of that child or someone else. But most of these situations that happen don't meet that criteria. It's a matter of, and in fact, it sometimes is a power struggle. It's a power struggle. And, we live in a world where, unfortunately, sometimes the answers to the question is about compliance and control. And, when we're thinking about compliance and control, we're not really thinking about connection and compassion and connecting with children and helping them. Dr. Lori Desautel wrote a great book called Connections Over Compliance, which I love the title, but the whole book goes into kind of the importance of that idea of, connecting with kids to help support them and understanding what they've been through. Those rooms, it amazes me, because I knew that Pennsylvania had laws around the use of seclusion in special education. But it's interesting to hear, your experience that really what they're doing is they're still doing it. They're just doing it under a different label.
It's under a different name. It's under a different label. And
it's almost like, we didn't call this a seclusion room, so it must not be seclusion, right?
Yeah. And I even questioned one of our bureau advisors for our Bureau of Special Education about it. And I'm like, but our legislation is saying it's an adverse technique. And they're like, oh yeah, but they didn't specifically put it in there as seclusion because they want to allow our LEAs to be able to make the right safety decisions for their students. I'm like, so what is not labeled about that. Just because you didn't use the word seclusion, you're saying no egress.
Right.
No egress.
Right.
Right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
That's just crazy.
Unfortunately, that's one of the shortcomings of legislation is that no matter how specific you think you are, no matter how clear you think it might be, what we find is people look for loopholes. When I began to take this issue on locally, one of the things that we found was that the district was saying to people, "Well, don't seclude, don't seclude." So what did people do? They said, "Well, how can we seclude without calling it seclusion? We'll stand in front of the doorway. They're not alone then." That was the logic. I mean, you'd actually, and really what we need to do is we need to help people make the shift. We need to move them towards better approaches to allow them to support children while reducing and eliminating practices like restraint and seclusion. We absolutely know that there are approaches out there that can be used and have seen them successfully applied.
I do want parents to know, though, that under the reporting is that every state had to report how that they were going to handle restraint and seclusion reporting. Well, PA under that does not have anything for seclusion because we're not going to be doing it, right? Because the states have to. If you're using these methodologies, you must report them to the federal government. So if we're not reporting them to the federal government, we're not meant to be using them. So parents jump out there and say, no, it's not okay. Use the toolkit from the Alliance, because I really think that we have to get on top of this because it is harming our children. Trauma is kept in the body. It's in your muscles. It's in your very fiber. So we know from ACEs when they first started doing it is that these traumatic childhood experiences affect people later on in life. Our children will never get over this.
Yeah, if you'd like, I just brought the toolkit up on my screen. And I can share
great.
That.
Do you want to bring that? Do you want to share that?
Absolutely. Yeah,
while you do that, while we bring that up at the stream, I'm just going to. So Mina said sensory rooms, the ones with music or something, there's actually ASMR should be a permanent replacement of seclusion quiet rooms. Quiet rooms should be banned.
Absolutely.
And couldn't agree with you more.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I mean, if you were naming these rooms, it always disturbs me to hear, it called a quiet room or a cool room or a blue room when in fact kids are being secluded there. I remember one child saying, well, it should be called the scream room. I mean, that's what happens. Kids go in there and they're really dysregulated. So we recently, trauma room. Absolutely. We recently worked with two amazing students from the Heller School of Social Management and Policy on a advocacy toolkit. And this was a pretty big project. And what we did is we wanted to put together something for individuals that were interested in advocating for change at a state level. So of course, when it comes to advocating for change, you can go to your school, you can go to your school district. But if those things aren't working, sometimes it's time to go to a state level. And in fact, hearing what you were saying about Pennsylvania, I think it's time to get some new legislation up there. So we wanted to create something that would give people something they could use if they were interested in really pursuing better laws in their state. So we developed this advocacy toolkit, and essentially what we've done here is we provide a little bit of background on restraint and seclusion. We provide some statistics here about restraint and seclusion. We talk about the process that we went through to create this model toolkit. There were over 50 sources of literature we looked at, 35 interviews. A lot of work went into this. And we interviewed people not only that agreed with laws, but also those that disagreed, because we wanted to hear different perspectives. We talk here a little bit about the issue of restraint and seclusion. And we have some quotes here from self-advocates. And you may recognize the name on one of those as somebody that just provided a comment here. At any rate, and we got some stakeholder input, but then what we did is we worked through coming up with what the definition should be, or what we recommend the definition should be. And of course, this is boilerplate. This is for somebody to take and, knowing the issues you've had in your state, you might say, well, we want to be more specific here, or we want to address that. Absolutely fine. This is just intended to get kind of the process started. We then go through making recommendations for legislation, and we offer it in a number of different areas. We're recommending bans on the use of seclusion, bans on, mechanical supine and prone restraint, bans on chokeholds and corporal punishment. It then goes into recommendations for reporting and notification, and we also have recommendations about training. So this is something you could take to a lawmaker and say, hey, we've noticed this is an issue here in Pennsylvania. These are the issues. Here's my personal story. I think we should do something. Are you with me? And you don't just need to go. And again, I'm talking about state level legislation here. So to be clear, I'm not talking about federal legislation. I'm not talking Capitol Hill. I'm talking about your General Assembly there in Pennsylvania, where your state laws are made. I'm talking about your local delegates, representatives, senators in Pennsylvania. And it's not a matter of, you can certainly reach out to the folks in your jurisdiction, but you can reach out to anybody across the state. And you can target people that might relate to some of this. So, folks that that have a person they love with a disability, people that that are for human rights and civil rights. So you can certainly get anyone in the General Assembly to help sponsor a bill for you. But this is easier than you might think. And I say easier. I don't mean easier to get the law passed, but I mean in terms of being able to call up a representative's office and say, hey, I see a problem. I've had a story and I'd like your help and I'd like to meet with you. Representatives often are eager to meet with you, eager to hear about what you think. They're elected officials. We go in here a little bit about the legislative process and we talk about telling your own story because your story is a really important part about that as well. And we end with talking about some ally organizations and whatnot. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that because I think it's a good resource as we think about, potential opportunities for, change because, you can work with a given school, you can work with a school district. But if you're not having luck there, you might go up to the state level. And again, it sounds like Melinda, you've seen where some of these shortcomings are in Pennsylvania law. So if you and others in Pennsylvania come together and say, hey, let's do something here, you can absolutely do that. Maybe you have organizations there that would support you as well. People like your disability rights organizations and others. So anyway, just wanted to make that point that, in terms of what you can do, there's a lot you can do. You can recommend better approaches to teachers and staff. You can, try to move forward with legislative efforts. There's a lot that individuals can do.
And even the Human Rights Commission, because this is not just, this is not just a legislative issue here. This is a global issue. So, if you've got families that are in a school district that this is happening and everybody's a little bit outraged, you can actually even request the local, the area chapter for the Human Rights Commission that can actually come out. We did have that at Hazleton, where they actually ended up having one of their meetings there to get an understanding of the issues that were happening in the district. So there are those ways to get to the legislative piece as well, because the Human Rights Commission will contact the legislators and the lawmakers to come to those meetings as well. Right. Now, whether they do or not, they still get the minutes and all of the public testimony. So that was one thing that I learned, but I will put up, this is my email. It's on my Facebook page anyway. I am looking to do more with this because I have tried to get change and I need, you can only beat yourself, so many times when you are only one person. This does need a village. Our children are being affected. And whether your child might not be directly affected, but I can tell you right now, when we have 12%, around 12% across the nation of students in special education, that's of all students, 12%, but 75 to almost 80% in the GAO figures are children with disabilities that are being restrained and secluded. They are the ones that are being harmed, and they're the ones that actually need to be, really worked with prior to needing to have this safe practice. To me, no practice is safe if there's even a 0.001% chance that it is going to harm or kill somebody. We specifically don't do things, right? We have laws now for seatbelts because why? That 0.1% chance of being in a critical car accident, they realize, safety, we better do this. So I'm totally with you, though, because, it really bothers me that when people are starting to look at their safety programs, the first thing that they're going to is restraint and seclusion methodologies. I'm going to pick up some questions that we're getting on the chat, if that's okay, and some statements that are being made. But could you also talk about what, if everybody keeps going, oh, well, this is the only way,
Right.
we know there are alternatives.
Sure.
What are the other
Sure.
alternatives?
Yeah,
Or some of them?
yeah, there are a number of alternatives. So, of course, in a very broad sense, it's looking at trauma-informed approaches. So when I say trauma-informed approaches, I don't mean that your school did a 30-minute continuing education event on trauma-informed approaches.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're literally trying to change the culture of your entire school to account for trauma, not just for students, but also for teachers and staff. There's a gentleman named Matthew Portell who runs a school. He's principal of a school in Tennessee, Fall Hamilton Elementary, and you can look that up. But he went in, I think, around 6 years ago now, with the goal of really creating a trauma-informed school. And part of that work was changing the culture of the school through the entire fabric of the school. It was being trauma-informed for the staff. It was being trauma-informed to parents. And he's had a tremendous amount of success in reducing punitive practices, in better supporting kids. And he actually also runs something called the Trauma-Informed Educators Network and features a lot of great information on kind of trauma-informed approaches. But there's other very specific things, in my district, as we were looking to answer that question of what are the alternatives. I began doing a lot of research. One of the first things I found was something called Ukeru, and Ukeru is spelled Ukeru, and I always spell that because it's a little hard to imagine how you spell it. Ukeru is a trauma-informed alternative to restraint seclusion, and what it really is well, let me tell you a little backstory. Ukeru was born out of a group called Grafton Integrated Health, and Grafton Integrated Health is a organization in Virginia. They are a nonprofit. They run a lot of different kinds of facilities, including private special education day schools, including residential schools. These are facilities that are often working with kids that have not been successful in their homeschool or their homeschool district. Kids that may be coming to them because they've had behaviors that have been difficult for the schools they've been working at. And if you go back, 15 years ago, Grafton, like everyone else, used a lot of restraint seclusion. They used it, in fact, so much that they had injuries to students, they had injuries to staff. They were at one point in jeopardy of losing their workman's compensation insurance because they had so many injuries that were occurring. And they had a new CEO that came in. His name was Jim Grafton, or no, Jim. Oh gosh, I forget his last name. Not Grafton. It'll come back to me. But when he came in, part of the Jim Gaynor, I think it was, when he came in, part of the goal was, what can we do differently? This isn't working for us. It's not working for the students. It's not working for our staff. And he challenged a team to come up with an alternative. And that team went kind of scouring the planet looking for better things to do. And when not finding really a solution, they began to develop their own. And it kind of took shape over probably a period of time where they came up with different ideas and tried different approaches. But ultimately, what they formed is a curriculum that's about understanding the brain, understanding trauma, understanding stress responses, understanding what's actually occurring when a child is having a difficult time. So really trying to, how do we prevent the need for restraint seclusion by better supporting kids? How do we develop meaningful relationships? What are the things that we can do? Now, Ukeru does have a physical intervention. And it's a physical intervention that is one that involves specialized pads. They're not gym pads, but they're specialized pads. And the idea with Ukeru is that if a child gets so escalated that they're kicking or swinging or really posing a danger, the pads can be used in a defensive way. And I say that defensive because what you do with Ukeru is you might lift the pad up. And while after lifting the pad up, you don't charge at the student and push them in a corner. You don't try to corral them in a room. You actually just use the pad to be defensive. And you would be backing up, trying to make yourself smaller, using a very calm voice, continuing to try to de-escalate the child. So the pads are there really to provide a sense of safety for the staff while they're able to continue to work with an escalated child. Now, I actually went through the Ukeru training because I didn't want to just talk about something without really knowing what the experience was like. And what I would say to you is that it's a far better approach in restraint seclusion. You're not going hands-on with a child. What they found at Grafton was after the introduction of Ukeru, they were able to completely eliminate seclusion from all of their facilities. And again, think about their facilities. These were kids that had not been successful in other settings who were coming in, having been told that they had a lot of behaviors, and they were able to completely eliminate seclusion. They were able to completely eliminate restraint from their special education day schools. All of the special education day schools, no more restraint. They were able to minimize the use of restraint in their residential facilities down to handfuls of instances. So, they still could happen there, but they were extremely rare. And all of that happened at the same time. They were able to save millions of dollars. They were able to increase staff satisfaction, and they were able to create a safer environment for everyone. So Ukeru was one of the things that we introduced to our school district. They began training about 3 years ago. And since implementing Ukeru, they have been able to significantly reduce their restraint seclusion. We also introduced training by Dr. Ross Green, the collaborative proactive solutions approach. And collaborative proactive solutions is, again, that idea, that model I mentioned earlier, kids do well if they can. And he's got a model of trying to help kids develop the skills that they're lacking, how to analyze, the situation and do it proactively. So the best time to, deal with a crisis is proactively before it even happens. By the time you get to a situation that things are escalated, you're too late. If you can act early and help kids develop skills and whatnot, you can do a lot more. So we also introduced Dr. Green's model, but there's a lot of other approaches. I love the work of Mona Delahooke, who I mentioned earlier, Laurie Desautel's, Bruce Perry. Bruce Perry is a world-renowned trauma specialist. He has a model called the neurosequential model. The neurosequential model of education has been used in schools. And again, it's about understanding the impacts of trauma. It's about better supporting people. So there's a lot of these approaches that you can use that can help to reduce restraint seclusion. So that's just a couple of them. But, I'll tell you that, that's not the problem. The problem is not that there's not a better way to do this. In fact, I was talking to someone yesterday who was very instrumental some years ago in reducing the use of restraint seclusion in hospital settings. And you hear a lot of the same objections. Well, we need it. We can't, what are we going to do if we don't have this? There are absolutely better ways to do it.
And there are, and I've shared all of those for all of those resources as links onto the chat. So everybody has them so that they can have a look at them and see, maybe this is something we should try. We have a question with Heidi. In respect to the misuse of medical equipment, such as a Rifton chair, how do states capture that data? As in PA, the definition of restraint excludes medical or therapeutic equipment. And I just want to say that our legislation might actually say that, but you can still not use it because then it becomes a mechanical restraint.
That's right. Absolutely. We, in fact, see Rifton chairs used fairly commonly for restraint. Now, a Rifton chair has a specific purpose for a specific child. And if it is, prescribed for use for position, that's a specific use. It is not then something you can use for the other child that you don't want moving around your classroom. So to use a Rifton chair to restrain a child would be a mechanical restraint. That would, in many areas, be illegal. I don't recall what Pennsylvania says about mechanical restraint.
You're not allowed to use that unless it's under medical order.
That's right. So, yeah, it would be illegal there in Pennsylvania as well. So back to your question, how do states capture the data? I would say that most data is never captured because most instances are never known. Beyond that, though, I think that the question is, what do you do if you find out that your child or a child is being physically restrained, or rather mechanically restrained in a Rifton chair? There are a couple of things that you can do. And we talked earlier, of course, about legislation. We talked about going to your school district, but you have other options here. You can file a state complaint. So if your child is covered under IDEA, has an IEP, you can file a state complaint regarding something like this. You can also file a complaint directly with the Office of Civil Rights. So the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights will look at complaints regarding restraint seclusion, regarding violations of civil rights. You could also go to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is also very actively involved in looking at civil rights, but also looking at violations of the ADA, looking at issues of restraint seclusion. We mentioned earlier how Frederick County, Maryland was recently investigated by the Department of Justice. And that led to a tremendous settlement where they're banning the use of seclusion. So you have a couple of different recourses. And of course, one option that's always on the table, I always encourage people to take the option that's going to get you results the quickest, but you may want to go back and do other things. So if you can change something at your school for your child, that's number one concern. But then you need to think beyond that. This is happening to other kids. What kind of change can we make for them? So another option, of course, is to file a lawsuit, and people do that. Now, not everybody's in a position to be able to file a lawsuit. That takes a lot of resources, and can be difficult to do. And school systems are typically have quite robust legal representation, and will try to do everything they can to exhaust the lawsuit before it gets moved along. So, there are things that people can do. I would also potentially reach out to the manufacturer of the Rifton chair and say, hey, we've got a school here in this district that's misusing your equipment. No harm in that. They actually have something on their website that talks about misuse of Rifton chairs. And, again, I imagine they've got to know that it happens a lot more often than they would probably like to admit.
If you know that the Rifton chair is not being prescribed to a particular child, and somebody else is being used to be restrained within it, that's also a children and youth complaint. Mm-hmm. So that's a child line. You call child line because that's an abuse. We wouldn't be able to do it.
Right.
And we have some fairly, unfortunately, in PA, it's a 50-50 when it comes to complaints against teaching. We have unions involved, and so long as that teacher does not speak to children and youth, they can't take the investigation any further. So it can be hard, but if you're seeing that there's a pattern of this teacher doing this to different children, they're going to have to do something about it. There's no choice, because if harm comes, then the district. Oh, that's another thing that you can do is, if that's happening and you're not getting any satisfaction through that, you could always do a GEBSA letter. So putting the district on notice that they as harassment of your child or discrimination of your child, they become, liable for any injury that then occurs. Yeah. So that's another jump in on that.
There are often a lot of things that you can do, but it's also not always easy to get the district to move. So they will circle their wagons, they will enter a defensive position, and some districts. Our district responded after some pressure was applied in a way that ultimately we collaborated towards a solution. And again, that makes it sound far easier than it was. But at the end of the day, we were successful. But other districts will do all they can to avoid admitting any fault. And again, we see these stories in North Carolina. I was talking to a group earlier, the head of special education talking about how seclusion is therapeutic, and it's just simply not true. Yeah. This is even under its intent, it is a crisis management intervention only to be used in these life or death situations. That's not something that's therapeutic. So, we see a lot of misinformation. We see a lot of gaslighting. Oftentimes, one of the issues here, and Melinda, you might experience this as well as you're thinking about bringing people together in Pennsylvania, is it's difficult, and parents are sometimes afraid to come forward. They have other kids in the school system. They're worried about retaliation. We've seen lots of instances where districts have retaliated. So, if you find a handful of people that have experienced this, you might find that very few of them are willing to come forward about it.
Well, and I just want people to know too, it's not always just about going to legislature. It could be that the group of parents are going to the superintendent or the special ed director as a group and present Yukuru or some other type of change, but have the data behind you. You can't just go in all angry
That's right.
and
That's
start
right.
yelling and screaming and saying, this is not okay, because nobody's going to listen.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and that's a great point. When I started this work, um, I was angry about what happened to my son. I was upset about what happened to my son. But as I began to do advocacy, I kind of had this thought that I want to be effective, which means that I need to be able to put my emotions on the shelf and get my data, do my research, really make a compelling case for why we should do something. And as I work with my district early on, I sent a letter to the superintendent and the members of the Board of Education. Got kind of the basic response, thanks, we'll look into it. Not much else happened. I worked to put pressure on them. So I reached out to outside organizations and I said, would you write a letter to my Board of Education saying you're very concerned about this? And they did. They began to get these letters. We talked to a journalist and our story got out on the news. So suddenly there was a fire there. And once there was a fire, they probably weren't loving me, but I kind of came back and said, look, we all acknowledge this is a problem. Can we come together to solve it? And ultimately, the superintendent was asked by the board to form a committee to invite me to be part of that. And I went into that with a whole lot of data and research. And, that was helpful in getting things to move. But not all districts are created equal. Some will, some will work with you, some will not. But I agree with you that approach means a lot, and it's really hard because we have every right to be upset. We have every right to be angry. There are very few policies within a school district that, when not followed or followed inappropriately, that can result in the death of a child. But restraint and seclusion is one of those. So it is something that you need to be passionate about. But at the same time, it takes an approach of coming in with your data, finding your allies, working together. And again, all of this to say, you can do things gradually. You can begin by reaching out to a Board of Education and superintendent and trying to work. And if that's unsuccessful, you might decide to go a different route. You might decide to go a legislative route. But again, think about what you're hoping to accomplish. And in my case, the first thing I wanted to accomplish was to make sure that my son was in a safe place. And he got home and hospital for the majority of this year that I was talking about after the 8th grade. And it was actually a pretty positive experience because they selected a teacher that had been teaching for a long time. He was in his 70s. He built a relationship with my son that now, 3.5 years later, is still there. My son goes over to his house on the weekends and does yard work for him. Never did he have to put hands on my kid. Never did he have to restrain or seclude my child. And when we were able to get my son in a non-public or private placement that does not use restraint and seclusion, he's been there for 3 years. He's doing fantastic. He'll be graduating next year. But that was the first goal, get my son in a safe place. But after that, I wanted to change that policy and that practice so it wouldn't happen to him again if he went back to that school. And I began working on that, and it really became bigger because I realized that there were so many kids out there that don't have anybody advocating for them. Parents that are led to believe these things are therapeutic or necessary. Kids that are getting worse and worse because they're being treated, in these ways. So, again, to agree with your point, there's a lot of different things that you can do to affect change, and starting locally can be a great place to start. But you might not end there, because even if you're successful locally, you might say, well, gee, what about if we move to a different district in the state? The same thing could happen again. So there are different places you can take it, but I do agree that where there's opportunity to be collaborative, that's a good thing. And it's not easy. It's not easy because we too, as parents, have been through a traumatic event. If your child has been restrained and secluded, it is traumatic. To know that somebody has hurt your child, that's a hard thing to move past. But at some point you've got to kind of get to the, how do we affect change?
So if Alison is still on, I just want to address this because she questioned about barricaded rooms to prevent eloping. That's actually a fire safety hazard, and you're not allowed to do it. So if that is happening within your school district, I'd be asking them for about their egress policy for and legal requirement for fire safety. Because, I mean, I had a situation, I had a client, we sat in the meeting and the occupational therapist said, oh yeah, I have to put the chair in front of the, and jam it under the door handle because, he keeps wanting to leave the room. I'm like, seriously, you're not allowed to do that. It's a fire safety hazard. You can't prevent egress for fire safety. And she's like, oh, but I don't know what else to do. I said, did you ever ask the special education department to have his para come in to the room that she could help navigate, that? Because he wants out, but every time that you put that chair under as well, she said, oh yeah, he just screams and screams. I was like, yeah, because he feels trapped.
Right,
and so
right.
he's trying to tell you, stop doing that, lady.
Yeah,
This child had no language whatsoever. And had she not said that in the meeting, we probably never would have known about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the parents were horrified.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and to that point, I mean, I would say that, barricaded room to prevent eloping. If the child's in there alone and they're barricaded in there, that's seclusion. I mean, so clearly,
well,
that
she
would
was
be
in there with him,
seclusion.
like,
Gotcha.
but
Gotcha. Yeah.
But I mean, that's still that fire safety hazard.
Right.
I'm going to throw it out there because we're getting about to the end of our time, and I am so glad that you were here. And I think we've got a lot of really good information. If anybody has any further questions for Guy, obviously, we've got his contact details up. I've got all the website and everything for you, and his contact details are also on his website. Guy is so responsive to anybody when they're contacting him. And I just want to thank you for that too, because that must take up a significant amount of time. But, Guy doesn't sort of let anybody leave anybody dangling. And I've known a lot of people who have gotten in contact with Guy. So I just want to, put that out there that, if you do contact him, give him a couple of days maybe, but he will get back to you. And, I just, any practice that potentially could kill a child.
Right.
No matter what the percentage, that's a percentage that's too high.
Right.
And so, sort of employ, educators, if you're being trained in these crisis management techniques, have a look at your Kudo systems and to see, if your school might change, if your school might be able to do that. And I think I think we've spoken before about this too, the cost to the school district to have these seclusion rooms, to use restraint, the cost for injury, cost for, staff injury is astronomical, can be astronomical. I think there was, it was like $10,000 for a seclusion room minimum, right? To meet the minimum requirements. Well, that could be put into training for staff.
Right.
But then you're not even going to end up with that staff injury.
Right.
So,
well, at the end of the day, these are really outdated and dangerous crisis management approaches. There are far better ways that we can be supporting kids. Restrained seclusion leads to typically more restrained seclusion because we're putting kids in a fearful state where they're living in hypervigilant modes. I mean, we can absolutely do better here. And, back to your point about teachers, we talk to a lot of teachers as well that are in schools that are doing this. And it's hard. I mean, teachers are also afraid of retaliation. I've talked to many a teacher who was in a school where they were doing this, who's raised concerns only to be surrounded by all of the folks that are doing this and being told, well, it's necessary, we have to do it. But there's a lot of hope out there. I mean, there's a lot of good programs. Last week I had the privilege of speaking to a master's certificate program run by Dr. Lori Desatel. She does a program in applied educational neuroscience. And this program in applied educational neuroscience is all about kind of understanding the brain and body connection, but it's helping teachers and students to make those connections and how we can, again, better support kids. So there are so many better things that we can do. If these are the kinds of practices being used in your schools, it's time for change. And again, lots of things you can do. You can give somebody a copy of a book. I love Mona Delahooke's book. I've given out copies of that to say, hey, here's a different way of looking at it. But it takes a change, and changing culture can be really difficult. Even once a system decides to do that, it can take some time to do it. So the important message here, I think, is to be persistent, and, if you've gone through this, I get it. It's something to a degree you want to put in your rearview mirror and move on with your life. But remember, this is happening to others as well. And your advocacy, your voice, your story could help make a difference. So, I encourage people, when you're in a space that you can do something, if you've gone through this, think about what you might be able to do. Melinda, I'd love to potentially connect you with some others in Pennsylvania as
That would
well
be great.
that might be worth working with. And, we can always put a call out on the Alliance. We've got a pretty good audience now of people that are in different states.
And I just wanted to reach out to parents too, and just, you might not think you're affected by your child being secluded or having a restraint when there hasn't been a physical injury. I was that parent because my son was extremely aggressive. But the day that I got called by the school district and I came in and my son's eyes were black. And he was 7 years old, and I had to see the video of the school SRO dragging my son by his hand up the hallway and his head slamming, and I could hear the thud even though I couldn't see it. Like I could hear it in my mind even though there was no volume, and his mouth was open as he's screaming, could see it, and 5 or 6 times his head had. And then I pick him up and he's vomiting all over me to get him to the hospital that he suffered a severe concussion. We found out 5 years later that my son has a cerebral small vessel disease. That woman could have killed him very, very easily. And it was by the grace of God that she didn't. And so, but I was the parent that was okay with, because he was destroying the classroom, and I was okay that they had to call me and say we had to restrain him today. I was okay with that until I wasn't.
Right. Yeah. No, I get it. I get it. Yeah. No.
That trauma never leaves you.
Right.
Never. So, but for parents, I don't feel guilty about it now. I admit that I was wrong in accepting this barbaric practice. I was wrong.
Right.
There are times when it's absolutely necessary, though.
Yeah, I mean, but you're also led to believe from the people that you should be able to trust that this is the right thing to do.
Okay. Yeah.
And again, I just like I would say that kids do well if they can. I think teachers do well if they can, meaning that I don't personally think that teachers get up in the morning and say, I want to go restrain a kid. But if that's what they're led to believe is necessary, and that's the belief system that builds, they're doing these things. Maybe, it's not that they want to do it, but they believe it's necessary. They believe, and some believe even further, think it's therapeutic, it's helpful.
Like North Carolina.
Yeah. And many other places as well.
But I mean, they don't give a side by side, right? There's sort of one option. Usually in one state, there's only 1 or 2 crisis management courses.
Right.
And usually they're approved by the State Department of Education.
Right. Well, and as I mentioned, I've gone through, well, maybe I didn't, but I've gone through one of those crisis management training programs, not because I wanted to learn how to restrain people, but because I wanted to better understand what they were teaching. And, what I found after going through that was I had a lot of concerns about what they were teaching. And some of that comes down to the fact that, what they were teaching had no trauma-informed background. It didn't talk about who was restrained and secluded the most frequently. While they had a matrix for figuring out when you might decide to restrain or seclude someone, it did not account for the risk of restraining and secluding some. Well, actually, let me take that back. Most of those companies don't teach in the use of seclusion. They only teach in the use of restraint. But it did not go into, what are the risks of using restraints. It talked about the risk of the child's behavior and not the risk of using restraints. So there's a lot of issues. The training industry is a big industry. And, they want to provide training in things that may be helpful. There is some good information there, but there's not enough of what they really need in there. They don't have the neuroscience. They don't have the trauma background. They don't talk about, in fact, what they don't teach is what your state law says. So if somebody takes a training course through one of the major training vendors in the country in Pennsylvania, the people that are trained aren't told what Pennsylvania laws say. They're just told kind of generally, here's things that you're going to need to look up on your own. And if your trainers, because most of these follow a train the trainer model, come back and they don't specifically tell people what they should be telling them, it's like a bad game of telephone where even the training that might be reasonable gets worse and worse with each successive generation of being taught. So there's a lot of issues with some of the training that's out there.
And if you don't know better, you can't do better. So,
Absolutely.
you know,
Yep.
and I believe that these crisis management training facilities came off of the psychiatric medical model from how they used to do the restraint.
Well,
in
yeah,
those facilities, right?
yeah, I mean, a
But
lot of
a lot of those places don't use those restraints anymore.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of those organizations train even to this day for people in the three industries, typically education, medical, and there's some HR related training that they might offer.
Oh,
But
don't know who we have to take down at work.
I know. Well, that's the funny thing. I remember watching one of the videos from one of these organizations, and it was kind of like that type of scenario. And I'm like, I can't imagine somebody being in the office and suddenly you decide that they threw their cup across the table in a meeting because they were angry, and you're going to restrain them. You would never think about that.
No.
And I mean, at the end of the day, children's rights are human rights. We shouldn't do things to children that we wouldn't do to anyone else. So anyway, lots to
It
talk
is, and
about.
there's a lot for everybody to digest. And
Yep.
if you have questions, like I said, you've got my email, you have Guy's email. Thank you, everybody who's hung in there with us. Was a lot of information, and I thank you, Guy. I'll have you stay on while I end the broadcast, but we'll be back next week with Eileen Perchak, and we're going to be talking from diagnosis to adulthood. And her son is now 25 and living independently, and we're going to really digest, how she felt as a parent perspective. Have a good night, everybody. Have a great week and great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks.